Today we are going to be doing our September native plant garden tour. And I have to be honest, it has been a horribly dry summer. A lot of these plants are looking pretty angry, and some of them might even be a bit embarrassing for me to share with you today. But I'm going to share it with you. I'll get right to the clips now, and we'll be able to show you what's done well, what has done not so well, and maybe you guys can share some tips along the way as well on how we can make these plants grow even better in suburbia. So let's get to it. Thank you so much for watching.
Over here we have our swamp milkweed. This is a first-year plant after sowing it last fall, and it's doing surprisingly well. For a plant that's supposed to like really wet feet, it is doing just fine. You can see kind of down by the base here that a couple of the leaves are turning a little bit yellow, but overall for such a young plant, this guy is doing great. So this year's patch of Scarlet Beebalm is pretty much done for. All of the leaves have dried up, they've all fallen off, and then the stalks have all gone dry and crispy. I am going to leave the stalks though, because as you can see here, they are hollow, and so a great place for bees to nest and put their little baby bees. So I'm either going to leave these stalks here, or if I do take them off, I might clip them down by the base and then put them in a part in the garden where they might be a little bit more discreet, where the bees can do their thing and be happy in the stalks. Now you can see here that there's lots of new baby bee balm that's growing, and so hopefully this will do really great next year and be even more resilient. And you know, this year it was just too dry for this plant, so very sad to see it go, but next year I think it's going to look great. Over here we have our obedient plant, and as you can see, it's still nice and green, standing up tall, even though this plant does like more water than some of the other plants in the garden, but it's doing great. And you can see that we have only a few more blooms left. There they are over there, and everything else is starting to go to seed. And just as the blooms bloom from the bottom to the top, it'll start going dry and crispy down by the base, and then it will move its way up to the top. And when everything is nice and dry and brown and crispy, that's when you know the seeds are ready for harvesting. If you don't want this plant to go too wild, then you can deadhead it at this point. If you don't want to collect the seeds, that's up to you. But I do like to collect the seeds and share it with friends so that all sorts of other people can have obedient plant as well. Over here we have our smooth blue aster. I just love the soft purple, almost lavender kind of petals that it has on this flower. Just gorgeous. And even though, if you've been following along, this one plant has been struggling to survive, I've gotten lots of blooms, and already we've got some that are going to seed. I'm very excited about that, as I'd really like to put some of these seeds down by the base here so I can really help to have this plant establish itself in the garden. And then of course I'll leave some for the birds as well. So here we have our wild Columbine plants from last year's fall sowing. So these are young plants that are doing really, really well. Despite all of the dry weather, it seems to be doing quite fine. All the leaves look happy and green, and I'm looking forward to hopefully getting some blooms next year. Here is our Serviceberry plant. It is looking really dry and crispy, and it's a little early in the year for that, I'm feeling. So I'm really, really worried about this plant. I love Serviceberry, and I was really hoping for a lovely shrub in this part of the garden. But as you can see, the leaves are very dry, and fingers crossed it's just an early entrance into fall, but I'm really, really hoping that this guy can make it through the winter and come back next year with lots of berries for us. These are our spotted Beebalm babies. These are from a fall sowing last year. So again, after one full year, this is what they look like. And they're about maybe 3 inches tall or so. So fingers crossed they make it through the winter and come back with beautiful spotted Beebalm blooms next year. I just love this plant, so I'm really, really rooting for it. Here we have our pussy willow that we propagated from a cutting last fall. It's doing really well. We've got lots of lovely green. It looks like some of the leaves are starting to turn yellow too at the beginning of fall. And perhaps somebody was doing some nibbling over here because all these leaves are gone for no reason that I can see, but we do have some new growth on this stem. So I think we've got at least 1, 2, 3 or so nice green stems that hopefully will do great over the winter and come back next year with some fuzzy little catkins for us. Fingers crossed. So here starts the embarrassing part of my video. This is the front part of my yard and everything is super dry. My Foamflower is so angry right now. It definitely did not get enough rain this season and I watered it as much as I could, but it's just not quite enough for this guy. So he is still holding on. You can see that there's lots of new growth kind of in the center here, new leaves coming, and it is shooting out little runners. So it's going to be okay, but fingers crossed next year we get a lot more rain than we did this season. Here is sad plant number 2. This is my Canada anemone. Now I think that if I had a whole bunch of this and this established itself more in my garden, that it would all kind of help each other stand up. So this one is kind of laying down. It looks dry, but not as pathetic as some other plants that are trying to hold on this year. And like I said in the last video, we do have new growth. So I am hoping for this plant to survive. And after it gets a little more wet this fall, I'll be transplanting it and hopefully it'll hang on in its new part in the garden. Back behind our Canada anemone, we have our Solomon seal, and it's doing really well. Again, I'm super surprised for the height of this plant, for the length of the stem, that it is just doing fine. It doesn't seem to mind this drought at all. So definitely a good one to consider for your shade garden where it has awesome height, really beautiful leaves, beautiful flowers, and is super drought resistant. So consider this for your shade garden for your native plant collection. Here we have our prairie smoke. Nothing much has changed since last month. It still has some lovely green. It's not looking too sad. This one can handle the drought a little bit more than some other plants in the garden. It does have some kind of dry leaves, but it's hanging on, looking pretty good. Then over here we have our cardinal flower. Look at how sad this plant is. It's just not happy here. Clearly, I don't even know if I've killed it. So fingers crossed the root system is okay. I'm gonna pull this out and pass it on to a friend who has a pond, and fingers crossed it'll come back next year. But I was definitely not treating this plant as it should. It definitely needed way more water than in the Boulevard Garden. So if you're going to plant cardinal flower, do your best to give it a spot where it might get a little bit more wet feet. Over here we have our wild blue lupin, and you can see that the older stalks, the stalks that had bloomed and then have passed, have gone like super dry and crispy, and the leaves have all, they're not very pleased. But this is a good spot for bees to maybe put their little baby bees into nests. So I'm gonna leave these stalks here even though they don't look so fabulous. But all of this new growth is looking really good. So lots of hope for this guy next year. And as I said in my previous video, a ton of seeds have dropped around here. So I'm really hoping to establish this in my Boulevard garden. Here's our Lanceleaf Coreopsis. It's kind of hard to see amongst the other things in the garden. As you can see, this is another embarrassing garden, and this one is at the front of my house, so perfect for everyone to see. Now this has gone to seed, so we've got some seed heads that are already ready. So when they get all kind of dry and crispy, that's when you know they're ready if you want to harvest them and you want to share them with friends or put them in other spots in your garden. And there's some of the seeds. So if you want to collect those and pass them on to friends, then that is what you're looking for. And you can collect them and share them or leave them for the birds if you'd like as well. I'll be doing a little bit of both. Over here we have our little blue stem grass, and I've got 2 little patches of it, one here beside the log and one a little bit back there as well. And this plant is doing great. It is dry out here. This is a dry kind of part sun garden, and it is doing fine. It's probably about 3 or so feet tall right now. And after planting it this spring, I'm really pleased with how well this has grown already in one season. Here is our prickly pear cactus, and it's doing really well. It's surviving. It seems to be okay with the drought. And this guy, even though I thought that it wasn't doing too well because of the kind of small amount of soil here in this rock, is still holding on strong. So I am pretty pleased with this plant and hoping that it'll grow over time and have a whole bunch of it in the garden. Here's my little patch of native black-eyed Susan. So this is the Rudbeckia hirta variety, and it's already flowering. I planted these seeds this spring, so really cool. Very excited about that. I wasn't expecting flowers in the first season, but it's doing great. Maybe we'll even get some seeds as well from this guy so we can make more of it. We've got a couple other patches as well. There's 1, 2, 3 right here in this part of the garden. Over here, these few dried up stalks are our wild bergamot. These are the dried seed heads, and so everything has kind of gone dry and crispy, and I think it's ready for harvesting the seeds. So I just took one of these seed heads here, put it upside down, and then kind of squeezed it between my fingers, and look at all the seeds that I got. So that's just from one seed head, and I'm just going to put these seeds down here and let them do their thing, because as I've said before, I really like lots of this plant. So I'm gonna kind of rub it with my fingers like this and just help it kind of direct its spot, so we don't have just random volunteers everywhere in the garden, but that I kind of create a nice little patch of it over here in our boulevard garden. Here we have our Golden Alexander, the plant that we had transplanted this spring. Again, we had no flowers this year, but the plant seems to be doing fine. It's got lots of nice green leaves. It's kind of in a shaded spot right now, but it does get kind of part sun, and it's doing great. So fingers crossed for some blooms next year. Here we have our wild Columbine, and it's doing really well. It's already starting to change color with the changing of the season. So it's going a little bit of a pinky kind of rosy color, and it's doing fairly well despite the drought. There's a couple dry leaves, but in general, it's doing pretty well. We've got a lot of new growth in the middle here too, so a happy plant, and fingers crossed with all the seeds that we spread this year that it'll be a nice big patch of wild Columbine in this part of the garden over time. Check out all of the incredible blooms on our New England Aster. This plant is about 3 years old or so, and it is doing so well. I was a little nervous. Last month, I noticed that there was some drying down at the base of the plant. So you can see the kind of dry stalks there, but it is doing quite fine. Look at all the blooms, and the pollinators are just loving it. We're seeing all sorts of neat little visitors. I've got a new one here that I've never seen before. If anybody knows the name of this guy, please let me know. We've got some hoverflies, all sorts of lovely little pollinators that are visiting the garden. Awesome plant for the fall, lots of gorgeous blooms, and even doing well despite the nasty drought that we've had this year. Here we have our butterfly weed. All of the flowers have passed and the seed pods are starting to ripen. And some of them will ripen sooner than others depending on when they started forming. But when they get brown and crispy and then start opening up like this guy, that's when you really know that they're ready to go. So of course you can leave them and let them kind of fly about the garden and find a new home for the seeds, or you can collect them and then put them exactly where you want to share them with friends. So here is the seed. And it just comes right, oh, there it's gone. Hopefully that makes some plants in my garden. But there's the little seed there. All these little wisps will fly away. Oh, and so will the seed. So there you go. I'll put a video on how to harvest these seeds up on the little card there. So keep a lookout for that. And here is our Canada goldenrod, and you can see that the pollinators are just so incredibly happy on this. There's a ton just buzzing around. This plant just volunteered itself into my garden, and I let it be, and now it's got a ton of action. It's ginormous, and apparently it seeds really easily. So I'm gonna let the bees enjoy, and pollinators enjoy the pollen and the nectar, and then when it's done flowering, I'm gonna deadhead it down so that it doesn't just make a giant forest of this in my yard. In case you were looking for an update on Nibbles, this is what Nibbles looks like now, and I don't think he's going to be nibbling any longer. He's in his chrysalis, and I have a feeling that this might be the overwintering generation of swallowtail butterfly, so I think I might have to find a nice cool place for him over the winter, because it doesn't look like he will be popping out anytime soon.
Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have any tips on growing these native plants in Suburbia, then please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. We can all learn from each other. Thanks again for watching, and please consider subscribing to follow along.